welcome to T2RL Talks, where we talk about everything airline technology. I'm Amanda Campbell, and I'm Head of Research here at T2RL, and I'm filling in on today's podcast as host because our usual host, Ian Tunnacliffe, is blissfully on leave this week. And on today's call, we're going to be talking about airline operations, and we have a few special guests in the studio today. We have got Bert Craven, who's Deputy CEO of T2RL, who's joined by John Szatkowski, who's VP of Digital at Seabury Airline Strategy Group, and Claire Taitte, who's VP at Seabury as well. So lovely to see you all.
Thank you for having us.
As I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about operations technology, and the impetus for it is that we're in the process of publishing, and even by the time you're listening to this podcast, we may have already published our latest report on airline operations technology. And that report was co-authored by the team here at Seabury. And so for our listeners who don't know anything about Seabury, I'm going to kickstart the proceedings by asking John to give us a brief introduction about Seabury and what you guys do.
Sure. So Seabury has a number of companies underneath its umbrella. Both Claire and I are from Seabury Airline Strategy Group. And there's about a number of us, about 50 of us that are working in the industry that have decades of experience working across probably three different groups between strategy, commercial, and operations. So Claire and I both come from the operations domain, and I have also crossover into technology and others. But our group basically comprises of, if you think of the airline industry, you buy an aircraft, you figure out what type of aircraft, how to outfit it, down to what routes to schedule and how often and where and whatnot. So we go from an advisory role that helps inform airlines and OEMs on how to look at how to market the aircraft that they're going to fly, all the way through day of operations and recovery. And so the day of operations planning, scheduling, crew pairing assignment, all of that type of capability that we're going to talk about in the report is really the domain that Claire and I specialize in. And we worked with your team there at T2RL to round out this year's research.
Fantastic. And Claire, can you tell us a little bit more about the report? Sort of what was the scope of the report, and what did it set out to achieve?
So this report is a refreshed look of a 2024 report that Seabury ASG worked on with T2RL, and we really go out there and look at all of the different technology providers in the market who are offering services to help airlines operate. And so that could be all the way from scheduling through planning, through day of operations, through recovery and continuous improvement. So we went out and researched the information that was publicly available. We did some also one-on-one conversations with specific vendors to see, what they were offering that had changed in the past 2 years. And then we go in and T2RL has a database where you're constantly scanning and looking to see, press releases and public information about which airlines are using which software. So it gives airlines who are looking to go out shopping for software, so to speak, a view into what's available, who the market leaders are, and sort of, our opinion about where the market is heading. So it's an opinion piece, but it also has facts based on public information of what's out there and who's using what. Although we don't name names for airlines, we just give percentages in the report.
Super, fantastic. So it's a great complement to what T2RL already report on. And so, 2 years since the last report. It's a long time, and yet it's not. Can you explain for us a little bit, John, about what's changed in the last 2 years?
Sure. A lot of the brand names that were there 2 years ago have either changed names, acquired new market entrants and whatnot. the market is fairly expansive, especially if you start talking about the startups that you see at a number of these conferences. But we really focus our research on probably the top 100-ish plus or minus. And big names have been acquired and or divested or merged and whatnot. Jeppesen is one of the ones that stick out in my mind. Last year Boeing's divested them to Thoma Bravo. SETA made a number of acquisitions, TA Connections and others. Skywise just recently, even though they had NavBlue as part of the Airbus family of companies, Skywise and NavBlue are a little bit more aligned. So there's a lot of that activity. I think that happens on a regular cadence, but it seems like it was a lot more frequent and bigger moves in the last few years than maybe the previous cycle, as it were. Mm-hmm. AI is the elephant in the room, whether or not folks are materially doing something to do something more than marketing or faster time to market in terms of developed capabilities are fairly known and universal and consistent across pretty much all industries as well as ours. But there are a number of companies talking about completely replatforming systems that they have done. I think IBS announced something. Jeppesen ForeFlight just announced something yesterday called Airflow. So there's a lot of activity around there in terms of how can I develop something more quickly or contemporary. But I think not only what has changed, but what is constant are still the core operational challenges. Those are the delays, the cancellations, airborne holding, civil conflicts, all the weather. Those are all decades old constraints that are still needing to be solved for. And I think what is changing more is the pace of new capabilities being brought to market, in the airline's ability to digest that or not, which is interesting as well.
Okay, super. So I guess what we're seeing is consolidation. We're seeing a lot of hype and talk about AI. But am I right in understanding that not a lot of new capabilities have been brought on board, or that we have seen a lot of innovation over the last 2 years that have resulted in concrete examples of airlines doing things differently?
It's an interesting question. I'll go first and then lateral to Claire and Bert. It's different in different pockets. My view is like the airport turnaround space has had rapid acceleration of capabilities being brought, whether or not it's computer vision by companies like Synaptic and Asaya, which are basically, computer vision isn't new. It's 10 plus years old as a technology, but the application of it to fill in blanks and voids of data that didn't exist. What is happening during the turnaround process? How do I look at for safety issues or all of these events and create now not only data capture, but data insights around those events? And so what has been sort of hyped and talked about for decades about creating digital twins in the IT world is truly happening. And what that means, though, across the spectrum of our report is that's not just focused on the airport. That propagates to the integrity of the entire airline operation. And so it's not an airport technology per se. It's a vital pipeline of content into the world. So there's a lot of, I think, the pace of innovation there and development accelerated differently than other places, just because there was just a lot more green space or white space for those vendors to go, whether or not they were new or incumbent, for them to go develop new capabilities where they didn't really truly exist before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of combinatorial effects. As John said, things like vision have been around. Some of the data sets that have been leveraged have been around. And it's these little tipping points where these things get combined and then automated and then maybe have a layer of AI put over the top that massively, it creates something far greater than the sum of the original parts. And then if that can be turned into a product that it's easy for airlines and airports and other players in the industry to use, and to plumb into their existing infrastructure, then you have a sort of a tipping point where capability takes a little step function. But it has been a sort of a crazy 2 years on, in terms of, we've had airframe issues, we've had engine issues, we've had airspace issues and conflict, we've had oil issues, we've had meteorological and climate issues. And so the demands on airlines to constantly adapt and constantly plan and replan and optimize and re-optimize, the demand side just gets more and more challenging all the time. And then on the supply side, it's sort of, there's a bit of a lag, but what we're waiting to see is the response to that and the identification of the opportunities that all of this additional demand brings.
So Claire, do you agree? Do you see it being quite lumpy almost in terms of innovation, where you get like pockets of activity where people build on the skills and the knowledge and the product that's gone before, and that's where we see that tipping point and that leap forward. And then other areas is a dearth or a lack of attention and a lack of innovation. Are you seeing it as quite lumpy across the landscape?
I think lumpy is a great term to describe it. I think some areas have shot forward more than others. And my background's in crewing. I spent 20 years in crewing at Southwest Airlines, both in the planning and day of ops space before moving into consulting. And what I experienced in my own career and what we've seen with multiple clients is they're still on 20 plus year crew tracking technology. And I think crewing is inherently more complex, and you're dealing with people. That's one part of it, but also the rules that have to be implemented. And I think from what I've heard from some vendors, they think, airlines are stuck in their legacy ways and they're not willing to, change. Well, crewing rules are not optional. You've either got your federal rules, which are your flight duty time limitations. Those are absolutely not optional. Airlines can be fined for violating those. And then you have the union rules, and those are mandatory as well. And every airline has their own flavor of work rules. And usually those work rules are even different between pilots and cabin crew. And the ability to implement those rules quickly in either a crew tracking replacement system or a day of ops solver is, I think, one of the big challenges. And we've seen carriers go down multi-year paths of trying to replace their systems only to start back over from scratch and abandon and decide to build in-house. So I think what we've seen with crewing is that, many airlines are still on old systems and using other vendors as kind of add-ons or building their own add-ons to get the information that they need from their systems. And those things may be using AI, but where I think there could be a real potential is if someone comes into the market and is able to quickly translate an airline's rules. Now, the airline also has to have all of their rules documented. And a lot of times I think they don't have those all well documented. It's in their experienced people's heads. And I know airlines lost quite a bit of experience during COVID. I think that really, if someone can take those rules and easily translate sentences into code, which I think is something that AI is fairly good at, I think someone could come in and disrupt that space quite easily, but we just haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity there. I mean, airlines are very wary of touching the core of systems that have been in for many, many years. But as Claire was saying, the ability to bolt things on, little appliances that come and add value, there's always going to be an integration challenge, but generally the rewards of being able to make even incremental changes are really significant. And the same goes for all of the historical things, aircraft trim, weight and balance, all of these things have within them really significant benefits. But different airlines have different levels of complexity. I mean, Claire was saying you have different rules between pilots and crew, but lots of airlines have different rules from one pilot to another. Where two airlines have merged, you'll have pilots who are on one contract and pilots are on another contract. And so, the sort of combinatorial complexity, this kind of systemic complexity, gets to a point sometimes where airlines just sort of almost freeze up. They get to the point where they can't move things in efficient ways. So that, yeah, so something has to give eventually there. And I think, certainly, if AI delivers on some of its promises, this previously insurmountable complexity might start to be unknotted.
And often, I guess, any sort of investment needs an opportunity. So an opportunity for reducing costs, making revenue, improving the customer experience. But from my experience, the revenue case always seems to be prime. It's always the one that people go after in terms of creating products and solutions, because that's often where finance put their budget. Do you think that maybe an investment in operations is always investment in cost savings, and that's perhaps what's holding the industry back? Or do you think it's more than that? Is that too simple of a way of looking at it? Claire, what do you think?
I think airlines are quite good at coming up with revenue justifications for commercial software improvements or technology improvements. Airlines, I would say in general, I would give a B, maybe a B minus, based on what I've seen for estimating cost savings related to a system. But when I think about full cost of disruption, and I think T2RL and ASG have put out a joint white paper about quantifying the full cost of disruption. What's really missing is the revenue impact on future bookings and customer sentiment related to disruptions. And we've seen multiple just sort of examples of huge disruptions and the, hundreds of millions of dollars at a large airlines. Probably, I think Southwest disruption maybe got into the billion range of both quantifiable hard costs. And then, I'm not even sure if those include the, intangible cost, the full cost of disruption related to future customer bookings or lack thereof. So I think, we have clients who are interested in this, and we've been able to help them better quantify that. I think there are a lot of opportunities for airlines to really do some analysis up front to quantify how these systems can help them save tangible costs and intangible costs, and that will give them a better justification for these huge spends, because these are multi-year replacements usually for a large airline system. For an add-on system that we just spoke about, little add-on systems, I think those can really be implemented much more quickly. But if you're talking about replacing an ops control system or a crew tracking system, those are, once in a career and could be career ending if they don't go well, once in a career endeavors. And those, usually are quite costly. And so airlines, I think, could get much better internal funding for those if they do more work up front. And I think they could get better results by doing that work up front, because they can know really what they need. What are the features that we need in order to be able to deliver these cost savings? And so doing that homework, doing that due diligence up front, I think will really benefit airlines when they're going out shopping for ops software.
The way I look at this is, as Claire mentioned, you have these big chunky investments that if I put my name on the line for that, it's to the degree that these are board level requests for funding, because they're hundreds of millions of dollars across X years. But what is the ROI? And the ROI is typically measured on cost savings and not even so much on revenue generation. But Claire's point about revenue loss is a good one. But I think where most of the ops centers mindset is, we are a cost center. We're not developing ancillary revenue opportunities. We're not developing new forward. Well, we could be impacting forward bookings. We could be impacting the opportunity to capture ancillary revenue. But they're typically thinking of, how do I maintain operational integrity so that I can start tomorrow clean slate. And if you look at it that from that perspective, what are the systems that help me operate? And those additive systems don't require board level approval to get funding. Those are, there's different echelons of spend, different echelons of risk to go take them in. And so if I am a senior executive or leader in ops organization within an airline, I have I have a portfolio of 50 to hundreds of different applications and vendors, but you typically have these core ones that we covered in our report. And I think the point is, if I'm going out to market, Bert and I saw this with Riyadh Air, a number of years ago, that's a once in a career opportunity to say, hey, you have a clean canvas to look at all of these systems. But in reality, I have a fixed budget. What am I going to do year over year? And am I going to replace my flight planning system or crewing system? If so, when? And how do I think through it? I think that's
business
kind of
changes are, particularly in ops. I mean, everybody hates their ops systems until you try and take them away and replace them with something else. And then it's like, don't touch anything. I just got it the way I like it. So, I think there are opportunities on both sides in cost and revenue. I think the issue is people aren't really measuring the link between operations performance and revenue in the way that they measure it between OTP and cost. So there's this element of the sin of the single indicator. I think the other thing is about cost savings feel real, right? I mean, demand is stochastic, revenue comes and goes, but a low cost base is your friend forever. And also, revenue tends to get discounted by finance in the business case. It may materialize or it may not, but cost savings always feel very real. But the key to all of this, the opportunity identification, has to come from data and analysis. You have to be able to create a link that you can show to the board when you go for your funding case and say, there is a direct proven link between what we do here and these elements of cost and revenue. And by changing this, we can move the needle on those things. And so not just the measurement of the causality, but then the measurement of benefit, having that data, having the telemetry, being able to do that analysis and prove the case is absolutely critical for getting these things signed off. I don't think that there's a lack of willingness to engage in these things. I just think that sometimes the business cases are a little bit hand wavy, and the risk always seems enormous when you're trying to move things around in ops.
Yeah, and that just leads to a lot of not necessarily indecision, but the choice to not do anything is just so much easier.
I think turn it into a no-brainer for me. Make it real. Turn it. I should have no doubt at all about signing this off.
And I think that's just a challenge in getting a project started, in launching the project and, sort of running through a project from start to finish and then implementing. The amount of work and extra headcount for an airline that takes in the ops space is huge. And I think we've seen clients underestimate that. I think I've personally underestimated that previously in my career at an airline. Airlines really need to do their homework at the beginning too on who do they need to sort of manage these projects from a subject matter expertise perspective, because the experience level is not as deep at many airlines because there have been a lot of retirements over the past few years, especially since COVID. So I think, having the right people sort of steering these large replacements is critical, and making sure they're not also running the operation at the same time, because the operation's always going to win. The criticality of making those daily decisions is always going to take priority unless you have dedicated, experienced people, set aside for the duration of these projects.
So I was going to say that the expertise thing is kind of critical because, there has been this sort of brain drain, this sort of loss of historical knowledge. And I think that airlines very often really benefit from an outside view, because it's very easy to develop a kind of tunnel vision around what's possible and what can be done and how what's the right way of doing things. And I think having the outside view very often, and understanding experience from other areas in the industry is a really valuable thing, just to take those blinkers off for a second and say, look, if we are going to make a change, let's step back a second and look at the art of the possible.
I think in report, we didn't really dive too deep in the sort of change management aspect of it. But, what we're diving into is pretty clear. Like Southwest and other airlines that I'd worked with previously, deploying just a flight tracking product 15 years ago. There wasn't the mindset of a product owner or a person that sort of had the point of the spear at the user level to be that sort of champion for the change, but also listen to the end users as to, if we are going to change from system A to B, how do you make sure it's successful? And one pattern that I saw then emerging, this is before scaling agile was taking root and all that, and I know that goes way off on a tangent, but the point here is there were people that were appointed as part of the project team that came off the floor. And that was at a time where the airline had enough resources to do that. Do you have enough staffing to run your operation? Because these people have to do administration work to do the training and requirements gathering for the RFP, but also the requirements gathering after the RFP as you're deploying. And what we had seen then was somebody had risen to become that sort of champion, and all of the users would come to them to be that first line of support, which is really critical as you go live or on an ongoing basis for version 1, version 2, version 3 that gets deployed. It's not just that initial tranche that gets deployed, but you're going to have a relationship with that vendor going forward. And a lot of what goes into the mindset of the airline is not just the actual RFP process, but how do you help us through change management? How do you adopt new requirements as we go forward? How do you assimilate that into your roadmap? But how do you listen to us as users and all that sort of stuff? And we don't get into that too much in our report, but I think it's a fundamental thing to understand. It's not just a one-shot selection. You're developing a new relationship, and so how is that going to track going forward as you select a different vendor or whatnot?
And all very good points. And I really am a little bit nervous about asking this next question, because I know that we put a lot, or I feel that we put a lot of onus on the vendors to get it right. And we put a lot of onus on the vendors to say, hey, the need is out there and we can solve this need. We can meet this need. When really it is a partnership approach, in my humble opinion, that, the airline and the vendors need to work together to solve problems. But to what extent do you think that vendors could do better in the operations space about making a case for change? Do you have any thoughts in that regard, Seabury?
Yeah, as I say, one of the points we made was that deployment flexibility matters. So that probably speaks to what I was previously talking about. But there's probably like 3 or 4 sort of things that we mentioned in the report. It was really around integration, whether or not it's within other core systems at the airline, other vendors, but also sort of integration amongst their product portfolio. So if, as a former product manager, you think about, well, what is my, unique value of my X number of capabilities with my product? How does that create a value proposition? Well, the value proposition now in the day of AI, allowing people to develop things much faster, is a little bit more challenged. It's not just 1 or 2 features. It's how do those features work together in concert with others to create more of an intelligent workflow for the users. So, for example, if you're adding another product on my desktop, is that going to help my throughput as somebody dispatching more flights or handling a scenario with more pressure put upon me? How can I handle that more efficiently? So for a vendor, as you have integration that is raised from where it was to where it should be, if it's a little bit more cohesive, then I, as the human, am no longer sort of the integration layer. you're now able to provide me insights to sort of manage by exception. So that puts the onus on the vendors to not just bolt on all these additional features, or an airline to bolt on other vendors to fill in gaps. I still need to reduce sort of that cognitive load of a user so that they could make decisions. You're trying to help them, not add more workload on top of them. And so integration has always been a point that has been sort of this golden thread for many years. But as you have more and more data, more and more sort of patchwork of other capabilities getting added, simplifying the workflow is much more paramount and more user-centered. Especially as you start adding AI. That's why you see a lot of folks shifting to natural language interactions of, give me insights as to why something did this, and then it'll go mine the data and surface it, as opposed to me, scanning through different applications to come up with my own opinion. So it's sort of a mixed, we're sort of in transition from sort of that legacy sort of scan and eyes on glass to this proactive monitoring with more and more data. So I think for a vendor, that means you need to figure out how to orchestrate sort of your, how do you architect your information layer and orchestrate all of those alerts and monitoring so that the user's workload is lower and they're able to make these cost or safety-based decisions much more efficiently and consistently. So if I made a cancellation decision given the same hand of cards and Claire comes in to relieve me, are we putting out a consistent product from the ops control perspective, not just the individual? So it's very layered there, but the whole point is the vendors just can't keep on adding more and more and more and expect the users to just be able to digest it, right? So you got to make it simpler as you add new capabilities.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, don't just be a supplier, don't just be a vendor, don't just be trying to sell your own product. Vendors are repositories of industry knowledge and best practice. They have lots of customers and they can bring insights to each of their customers on what the art of the possible is in terms of trying to improve. And then the second thing they can do is break down the silos and join up the data, as John was saying, and help the airline build the business case for moving towards that North Star of optimization or whatever it is. And that's the difference really between being a supplier and being a partner. And the best advert that a vendor can have to the industry is that all of your customers are successful. That they are the ones who are doing the most optimal work. So your greatest advert is how well your customers are doing. Oh, and come to our conference and tell us about it.
And I think that is, what I was thinking is that vendors can do better to earn the trust of airlines. And I think airline operations people are more skeptical maybe than some of the other areas of the airline because they're dealing with, where the rubber hits the road. So I think vendors would do well to underpromise and overdeliver, and to have that proof that you mentioned, Bert, of happy customers. And focus. It's a tricky balance because vendors need to market, they need to get interest in their products, but the operators that I've worked with and talked to at conferences throughout my career, there's an inherent distrust of vendors because they feel like they're being sold something that isn't what it seems when they see it in front of them. And I don't think that's done intentionally, but I think, vendors need to have a better understanding of the airline's operation and even that specific airline's operation before they're going and selling. And then I think they need to be really upfront about what they can and can't provide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. I have just looked at the clock, guys, and believe it or not, we are at time already. I guess one last question, and it's probably for me because I am not an operations systems expert. So I'm hearing a lot about users and I'm hearing a lot about, making it easier from inside the operation. But I'm kind of imagining it from a customer. So if I'm a traveler and I'm going from Dublin to T2RL Engage, which takes place in September in London, and the airline that I'm on has made maybe some suboptimal choices in its operations technology, what's the worst that can happen to me? Like, paint me the picture from a customer's perspective. Claire, what could I encounter if airlines make suboptimal choices in this regard?
So some of it is the data that's displayed to you in the airport, on the screens, in your app. If the operations data isn't accurate, you're going to be making decisions based off of inaccurate data. Then the airline may also be making decisions based off of inaccurate data. They may be assigning a crew to a flight thinking this flight's supposed to leave at X time. Well, that crew is legal for the flight based off of this inaccurate time. And so now you have a crew timeout and your flight might be canceled when you've been sitting there already delayed for hours. So I think, some of it could just be, why is this flight delayed? I don't have the information. The screen's telling me it's this time versus getting on the plane, getting boarded, sitting there for a long time, and then not getting to your conference in London and missing out on that. So I think, it can be just as simple as misinformation and as, impactful as missing a wedding or a funeral or a conference.
Well, that's simply done. Claire, you have now made me an evangelist for better operations systems in the airline domain. Okay, guys, I think that's time's up. So thank you all very much for joining T2RL Talks today for a very interesting discussion on operation systems. I would like to thank Claire and John from Seabury Airline Strategy Group for joining today's conversation. In addition to Bert Craven from T2RL for joining in the conversation. Thank you very much. And for anyone interested in this topic, hopefully by the time this podcast airs, the report that we've been speaking about today will be available to download for subscribers on t2rl.net. Thank you very much, team in the studio, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in and listening.
Bye. Thank you.
Awesome.